Okay, let me introduce you to Richard Palmer, who is the director in charge of corporate affairs for Lawson Lewis Blakers, the well-known legal firm in Eastbourne, also with offices in Lewis and Peacehaven. So, Richard, we've been talking about the effects of the coronavirus and the impact on so many businesses that are clearly have not prepared for something like this. And you wanted to just share some ideas about the question of commercial rents to start with.
Yeah, so hi, Mike. So at the moment, this is not a great time for businesses. And one of the main overheads for business is rent. It usually goes staff costs, rent, and then other outgoings as well. Now, the difficulty is that where tenants are on a lease, they still have to pay their rent even in times like this. There's very, very rarely something in the lease which allows them to get out paying rent. So what are they going to do if suddenly the cash flow just dries up, which for a lot of businesses, it is just drying up now, especially where they're forced to close. So in terms of what the government has done, firstly, they have introduced effectively a moratorium on landlords being able to forcibly terminate leases, which is known as forfeiture. So landlords can't do that for the moment. That is set to end on the 30th of June. So we've got about 2.5 months where landlords aren't going to be able to do that. However, the downside of it is that landlords are still able to seek those rents, and they are still able to bring debt recovery proceedings against tenants, which effectively, it just looks like it's going to kick the can down the road a bit, because in 2.5 months' time, if tenants haven't been able to pay their rent for 2.5 months, the landlords may look to bring forfeiture proceedings at that point, and some of these people may have money judgments against them already. It's going to be difficult to see what's going to happen in 2.5 months' time, because there's going to be a massive backlog anyway. If there's landlords wanting to bring claims, the courts are already in backlog because they're not having hearings. So those claims are going to be pushed further and further back anyway. And it seems to me that if tenants are thinking that they're going to be struggling with paying rent, it's probably best to take some steps now to try and put in place some sort of arrangement with the landlord, effectively to kind of mitigate it. And there's a couple of options dealing with that. Whether the landlord will go for it or not will depend on the landlord's own circumstances.
So what would Lawson Lewis Blakers be able to do to help in that process?
So firstly, we can have a look at the lease and see what the lease says and whether there's anything that might help a tenant in these circumstances. But if there isn't, we can see what the options are for negotiating with the landlord. So we might be able to look at whether we could request a rent holiday, and that rent holiday could be dealt with in a couple of ways. Firstly, we could ask the landlord simply to waive the rent for, say, 3 months. You'd have to have quite a generous landlord to do that. Alternatively, we could say, will they defer the rent and add it onto future rent payments? Some tenants will have a deposit in place, and it might be that the landlord will be willing to allow the deposit to be used to pay for the rent for the next few months. Now, of course, the benefit of having a deposit from the landlord's perspective is you've got a pot of money there for the end of the lease, so that if there are dilapidations, they can use that money to carry out repairs. However, these are extremely unusual times, and the landlords might just be grateful to have the money now, depending on their own situation. Because, just because a landlord has property assets doesn't necessarily mean they're cash rich as well. If they're private individuals who have a property asset and they have a source of income which has dried up because of the same situation, then it could be they're not going to be in a position to allow a rent holiday unless they're going to be able to take their money from a deposit.
Okay, so the message is, don't bury your head in the sand, take advice and take action, because taking action now will prevent an unexpected action coming down. As you say, kicking the can down the road is not going to stop an action unless you've actually engaged now. Absolutely. While people are mindful to be helpful in the current climate.
Absolutely. And all businesses should be doing a cash flow forecast at the moment if they think they're in difficulties, and speaking to people like yourself, Mike, to help them with that. But if it looks like there's going to be any problem in not paying rent, the best thing to do is go to the landlords now and say, look, we're okay at the moment. In a month's time, we might have difficulty. You've got a bit of time then to sort things out. It's just best to have the conversation. In normal times, it might not always be a great thing to go to your landlord and say, hi, we're going to have a problem paying the rent. But there's just so many people in the same boat. And I think most landlords would be grateful to have the conversation so that they know for their own circumstances and their own cash flow what's happening with their tenants.
Right. Okay, so on the subject of burying your head in the sand, we realise that it's been a shock to everybody, and so everybody's just they're dealing with survival. So many people have furloughed staff just to buy some time, and thank goodness for that step that's been made. They've deferred their VAT and their PAYE again. That's just a cash flow issue. But you wanted to just talk about shareholder agreements in terms of, like, thinking of it in terms of corporate wills. So most people, over 50% of the adult population in this country, have not made wills. So very few companies have actually ever thought about the idea of a corporate will, let alone shareholder agreements. Do you want to comment about that?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things. I find that people don't really plan for this side of business very often. People tend to plan for it more in their personal lives than in business. But if you've, say, got a firm with two shareholders and one of them dies, what happens to those shares? It can be quite a serious issue, because shares are obviously an asset. What happens to them? Where do those shares go? Do they go to a family member? Or if they do go to a family member, are they going to try and sell it on? So the shareholders agreement can place some sort of restrictions on what happens with shares in the event of someone's death. It might not necessarily, in practice, mean that the shares are going to go anywhere. If you've got a shareholder and they die, it might just transfer to the family, but you might not want the family members to sell it on to anyone else. Alternatively, a shareholders agreement could say that in the event that someone dies, that the remaining shareholder has the right to buy them back straight away. So shareholders agreements do lots of things, but they do cater for situations where a shareholder's died. So I think in terms of business planning, it's a really essential thing to do. And it's not just death, it's also incapacity. Shareholders agreements can deal with incapacity. So in the event that someone is permanently incapacitated, they might provide for their shares to be offered to the remaining shareholders. And that's also supplemented by things like corporate lasting powers of attorney. So these are documents which provide that the business affairs of a shareholder who is incapacitated can be continued by the remaining shareholders, because sometimes you're going to want your business to be run by the people who know how to run the business rather than someone in your personal life. And frankly, the remaining shareholders would be grateful to have that in place so that they can continue to run the business in their absence.
Yes, I mean, I've heard a case where we've spoken to the shareholders who are family business, typical of so many family businesses, and suggested they actually record videos, because where they've got extended families who might become beneficiaries, for example, of a trust arrangement, they'll be agitating to say, well, why on earth can they not get value from the shares? But when the wishes of the people who've put it, the trustees, not the trustees, the set laws, who've put the money into trust in the first place, have not been explained to them, making a corporate will, let alone a video, which is even more powerful than a few words, sort of read out by the retained lawyer, with dust coming from his shoulders, over this grand old table, reading to the assembled like you see in the films. They don't really not going to believe it, but they can't argue with parents or grandparents or uncles or aunties who are saying in a video, look, this is what we want to happen to our shares. You will eventually, we're looking to provide for you, but this is the reason why. And that it's there for everybody to see. And it's so easy to do, as we're doing here now, recording for people, because most people now believe more what they're hearing rather than anybody can write anything. They don't know how valid it is.
Yeah. But you also need to have the business plan in place with the shareholders to start with. You need to have this discussion now. And if you have the shareholders agreement in place, then there's an understanding about roughly what's going to happen in the future anyway. So there's already an expectation then of what's going to happen. I think that's really important. You know, when you've got a company with different shareholders, it's like a family in a sense anyway. Even where it's not a family business, you have such a close relationship with these people, and you know, it will cause those people difficulties sometimes if you haven't put proper arrangements in place to deal with what happens with your shares if you die. I mean, if you die and your shares get transferred out to a family member, but the other shareholders don't like that family member, that's not going to be great for the future running of the firm. So deal with that in your shareholders agreement, and provide for how that's.
And it's so relevant now because it's all very well. It sounds as though we're being morbid, but you know, we are increasingly hearing on the radio and on the television how the number of people who 2 days ago were symptomless suddenly get ill very quickly and are asked to sign a do not resuscitate form.
Yeah.
So in other words, they're asked to sign their own death sentence. Now, if so many business owners are suddenly put in that position, they would never have dreamt it because they've always believed they're infallible, that they're never going to die. This is something for something else. But so many people have been caught out. So it's so relevant. And this period of lockdown, rather than people just sitting there reading their books or clearing out their cellars or their garages, what they really got to do is actually think about clearing out their heads and to think about their business. What could they do to make sure there's something there to leave should the unfortunate happen to them?
Absolutely. This is the time to do the things that you've been putting off now. I mean, if you've been outside in your garden painting your shed because you've been putting that off for a long time, well, actually doing a shareholders agreement and doing your will is much more important than painting your shed, frankly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Richard, I think on the belief of keeping it short and simple, but keeping important points, we ought to bring this to a close now. And I look forward to discussing other very important matters that you can share with your clients in the